Hi, I'm Violet, and welcome to Hidden Heritage, the podcast that brings you inside Great Britain's favourite destinations, with help from custodians, historians, artisans and experts. Today on Hidden Heritage, I'm joined by the founder of Worthy Earth, Harrison Fannon. Worthy Earth started in 2020 with the vision of creating a flourishing market garden on a quarter-acre of disused farmland in Martyr Worthy, Hampshire. Inspired by the regenerative agricultural movement, they envisaged and created a no-dig market garden on the land over the autumn and winter of 2020. Since then, they've had 2 entire growing seasons, selling weekly veg boxes around Winchester and Itchen Valley. They also built 4 more market gardens, one based at Dummerdown Farm and another at Blenheim Palace. Worthy Earth believes that small-scale food production is a solution to the range of social, economic and environmental crises that we face today. And today we're going to talk about it and how preservation doesn't just mean protecting what we create, but the natural world that surrounds us. In this episode, Harrison explains how Worthy Earth began, the amazing things that they have already accomplished, and how the key challenges he encounters in his work are shared by the national heritage. And Harrison also gives us his top 3 destination recommendations. But first, let's learn more about Harrison in his own words. Harrison, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm so happy to have you and so excited to get into this conversation because it feels so topical and topical sounds like it has a shelf life, but I'm so excited because I think this is the future invariably of farming. So I guess let's just start for our listeners. Tell us a little bit about you and your background.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm Harrison. I'm 27 years old and I started Worthy Earth with my brother and school friend back in 2020. It was after I'd graduated from university and sort of lost for things to do, but I had a passion for the idea that we needed to teach ourselves how to grow vegetables. Mm-hmm. And without any farming background or horticultural training, we sort of just plunged ourselves into this kind of self-taught journey into growing veg. We started the process by just cultivating my mum's back garden at home.
Wow, and which is where?
Near Basingstoke, in a small village near Basingstoke. We were reading a lot of literature from Richard Perkins and Charles Dowding, who were 2 kind of key figures in the no-dig market gardening world. Charles Dowding, that you may be aware of, is sort of the godfather of no-dig. He's pioneered this method of, rather than tilling the soil or ploughing the earth, you just lay compost down on the ground, and it's a much more nature-friendly way of growing veg. Richard Perkins, on the other hand, is a sort of regenerative farming pioneer and has taught and has given useful ways of actually making it work as an enterprise. So the 2 of them together gave us the feeling that we could give it a crack.
Wow.
So,
and when were Charles and Richard, are they still with us today, presumably?
Absolutely,
And
yes.
So their books on sort of regenerative farming are kind of in the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, exactly. Charles Dowding's become a good friend and ally to us. Richard Perkins out in Sweden. Mm-hmm. And yeah, we just read their books, watched their online videos and felt as if we'd gained enough learning to be able to put this into practice. And that's where we asked a friend of ours that's a farmer near Winchester if we could rent a small piece of land off him and give it a crack at creating our own small market garden that would provide vegetables for the local community in veg boxes.
Wow. So many questions. But firstly, how on earth, so you didn't study agricultural farming or anything like that at university, but you just had this sort of innate passion and desire for getting into this sort of space.
Yeah.
How did you get into personally kind of the interest for it outside of reading those books?
I mean, I studied archaeology and anthropology at Oxford, and I was left with a kind of deep cultural learning that spans, millennia. I recognize that growing food is the oldest culture in the world. It's the foundation of our lives. And when I moved back home after university, I was running my mum's cafe, which is in the centre of the village. We were cooking a lot of vegetarian food. I was seeing how much of the produce would come in wrapped in plastic from overseas, lacking in nutrients, lacking that freshness. I was also growing up in the countryside, expecting to see lots of farmers out there doing their work, but I was actually just surrounded by monocultural farms without really any humans doing any of the work. So once I felt as if we were alienated from good quality fresh food, which we could use in the kitchens, but also that kind of cultural feeling of knowing where your food comes from felt very sort of distant from us as we were growing up.
Explain what you mean by tilling. Because that's been the tradition of farming of all, of our most recent history. Do you know where that sort of type or style of farming started, and give us a little bit of context.
Sure. Well, I mean, on a large scale, ploughs are used to turn over the soil, which prepares the ground for growing and planting vegetables. And that's been used for a long time, horses pulling ploughs. In terms of actually starting a market garden, often you would, turn over the soil, dig it over. But we've learned through Charles Dowding and reading other books that basically that process destroys a lot of the microorganisms that live in the soil, which is what gives the soil its fertility. So we're at a tipping point now in society where we have all of this farmland, which only has several years left of being able to provide the fertility that it needs to grow veg. So the no-dig approach is basically giving back to a depleted soil and taking that as the starting point for growing.
And you set up Worthy Earth in 2020. Tell us a little bit about the process. So you started in your mum's garden. Where have you got to today?
Yeah, so I mean, it snowballed relatively quickly. After our first season where we were growing food for the local community, one of the relationships that we made in that year was another couple that owned a farm, Dummerdown Farm. They were so impressed with what we were doing there that they asked us if we would come onto their farm and do a bigger market garden for them. So that kind of snowballed into us doing that. I then also moved to Oxford at this time, and I was looking for a place to do some no-dig growing. And I had a chance to go to Blenheim Palace with a friend that was going to be doing some catering at the Autumn Festival, which they host inside the Walled Garden every September. When I went to that meeting, I was shocked to see that even in the Walled Garden at Blenheim, like a prestigious place as it is, they weren't really growing any produce of their own. So in this meeting, one of the directors was there, and I was able to kind of cheekily say to them, how can you do a harvest festival if you're not actually growing any produce of your own? They said that that was a fair comment and asked me to write a proposal as to what it would take to actually build a kitchen garden and then to also manage it full time. In our second year of actually growing vegetables, we'd gone from one very small site in Hampshire to now having 3 sites, one of them being Blenheim Palace.
So exciting. And it makes sense probably to now come on to, because that's one of your first destinations for today that you're, that you have such an affinity with because of what you've just described.
Yeah.
I think we all probably know where Blenheim is just because it's Blenheim. So it's just outside of Oxfordshire, just outside of a little town, I think, called Woodstock. I never know whether it's a town or a village, but it very much feels like a town when you're in it. And it's the most extraordinary. It's the only kind of royal palace in the country. We've had previously guests on that actually, are part of Blenheim, either have grown up there or indeed work and look after the collections. But tell us a little bit about, the work that you've done at Blenheim and why you've chosen it as your first destination.
Well, I mean, I guess we kind of fell into it in a way. Having a close proximity to Oxford means that I can get there every day. I've been there for 3 years now. The walled garden poses such an amazing aspect for growing vegetables. Obviously, walled gardens are created with the sole purpose of being able to grow fruits and vegetables in a sort of intensive manner. The walled garden is huge at Blenheim. It's nearly 9 acres in size. Wow. And the small kitchen garden, which has been fenced off and allotted to us, is about half an acre. And over the years, we've basically turned that from quite, say, sort of arid, bare soil environment into a quite flourishing, colourful kitchen garden.
Tell us about what you're growing at Blenheim and what its significance is to you as like your third site that you've now worked on.
Well, we're growing food for the means of serving the various catering outlets that are there. So there's a sort of more formal restaurant and then 2 kind of more cafe type restaurants and a pizzeria. We grow everything that you would ordinarily find in a kitchen garden. So root vegetables, salads, herbs, brassicas. We have the use of 3 beautiful old greenhouses that we grow tomatoes, aubergines, courgettes, peppers.
Wow.
And whatever is surplus to the needs of the kitchens, we're giving in staff veg boxes. There's a huge number of people that work at Blenheim. So it's kind of it's a working community. And so we're, providing fresh vegetables to all the different outlets there. And over the last 3 years, we've steadily increased the size of the walled garden, of the kitchen garden within the walled garden itself. And just kind of, because it is in the public eye as well, the walled garden, there's, thousands of people every week come through and see it. It's kind of a demonstration as to what can be achieved on a small scale by growing. The neat, orderly rows of vegetables, the really dark, rich compost never fails to attract the attention of the people that pass by. So often when I'm working, I often have conversations over the fence with the people that are looking in. Yeah.
What kind of questions are they asking when they're sort of stopping and chatting to you?
I mean, less so questions, more kind of advice about gardening. Everyone,
really?
Everyone's always willing to give their sort of 2 pence about what I could be doing better.
But it's so amazing. It sounds like you've, in your own words, self-taught. But what do you see as the significance significance of of reinstating this wall garden as was and kitchen garden as is now that you've reinvented? Why is that important to Blenheim and, as you said, the community locally, do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, back in the day, the entire walled garden would have been cultivated, that full 9 acres. And we know that back then it would have employed 15 or 16 full-time vegetable gardeners. After the war, the Second World War, I think, a transition was made, not just at Blenheim, but kind of across the board in the country to stop producing as much vegetables and to kind of import food, to eat highly processed foods instead. So it no longer became economically feasible, I think, to provide 16 full-time salaries to veg growers when it was just cheaper to buy it all in. Now that we recognize that that's had a huge environmental impact, via the immense air miles that are involved with bringing food over, how the nutrition of eating vegetables that have flown many miles and been wrapped in plastic is actually having detrimental effects to public health. In this climate, it becomes more urgent to actually grow our own food again. And I'm proving without really any horticultural training that it's within all of our capacities to be able to grow food. That this is kind of, as I said, the first human culture. So
what do you mean by first human culture?
I think that it's at the foundation of everything that makes us human beings, like how we eat, how we feed ourselves every day. So when we remove all of that from our culture, we actually lose a huge amount, culturally speaking. Knowing where your food comes from, being able to eat fresh food, and all the culinary sort of practices that come from that are going to be lost if we don't kind of re-stimulate more growth of vegetables in the country.
Yeah. And I guess the one thing I failed to ask earlier, but what is regenerative farming for those that don't have a clue what we're talking about?
Well, it's kind of a catch-all term at the moment, which is becoming quite trendy. But I think at its heart, it's the idea that conventional agriculture has actually been stripping resources from the earth. And therefore, we can farm in a way that can regenerate those resources. And that might mean, in the context of large cattle farming, actually sort of regenerating the soils by, rather than keeping cattle in one place, allowing them to mob graze around. It might mean using farming practices that encourage biodiversity, planting wildflower meadows, not just growing one thing all the time in monocultures. Not using chemical fertilizers or pesticides that have an adverse effect on the environment. It's basically trying to right the wrongs of several decades of chemical farming.
And my understanding is that kind of chemical farming that's been going on and practiced, and it's still practiced today in large part by lots of farmers across the country. And I think there's this real tension, because I spent a lot of time with the King's charity that it was called the Prince's Countryside Fund. It's now called the King's Countryside Fund, but I did a lot of work for them last year, and I was travelling up and down the country meeting all these farmers that are recognising there's a need to transition to a different type of farming. But invariably, my understanding at least is that kind of chemical farming in this country really sort of spawn, particularly, in large part, and I'm, a big fan of the EU, but I think I'm right in saying it was the EU's sort of endowment of subsidies to farmers to farm in that kind of way. That meant it got so sort of commercially viable for farmers to farm with pesticides. There's a kind of commercial element to it that sort of, I don't know, I always feel with the old farming practices, it has been so incentivized by big governments and by kind of commerciality, as opposed to the farmers actually doing what innately they perhaps probably agree with you is the right thing to do. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, my challenge and pursuit is not to shame conventional farmers into doing something differently. That's not my mission. I don't have a large scale farm. I'm not trying to do things on a large scale. What I'm trying to do is actually provide a kind of small scale alternative that can be replicated around the country, that can inspire and sort of make up a difference that, unfortunately we're lacking at the moment. So I have a huge amount of sympathy as well for the farmers. There's no money in farming, it's a tough gig. We need to stick together and not be so divisive in discussions about this, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. But really fascinating. And also I have such an affinity for Blenheim, because they've got a whole innovation department at Blenheim, which you probably know about. And I think, again, they're leading at the fore with what they're doing with Where the Earth and with you. And I've seen at Beaver, there's a sort of 4 or 5 acre kitchen garden that's been redundant for 40 years. And that's not because we don't recognise the value of what it once was, but as you said, it all comes down to cost. And so I think it's such an exciting opportunity to look at these places and spaces in any way. So it's so cool. So basically, when people next visit Blenheim, yes, you have the palace, yes, you have the grounds, but you've also got Where the Earth and the kitchen gardens to go and see, which is really cool. Now we're going to move on to what you're doing today. And we've learned about the background of Where the Earth and how it came to be. But what are some of your favourite projects now that you're working on?
Sure. I mean, on top of Blenheim, we also have another estate that we've got a contract with down in Hampshire called Rotherfield Park. And it's quite an unusual one there because the owner of the estate has basically commissioned us to create a market garden in the centre of the village, East Teested.
Wow.
And the idea there is for us to run a kitchen garden, well, in a field, basically, which is going to serve a kind of new centre of the village itself. And it's being funded as a way of being able to provide free vegetable boxes to the people that live in the village.
Gosh.
As a way of kind of generating a sense of community, improving the diets and just health of the people, which is a really cool project. Other than that, I also run another market garden in Oxford in my sort of spare time, which is in a village called Bletchington, and that's received an awful lot of support from the university colleges. There's a charity in Oxford called Good Food Oxfordshire that are kind of trying to get the university colleges to procure a lot of their food locally. And we are one of the producers that is on that scheme. So we're basically producing salads, herbs, lots of different types of vegetables that are all going into the college kitchens every week, which is kind of the first stage of a journey to try and get good food into sort of various institutions in Oxford. It started with the university, but it's also going to be schools, hospitals, and so on. So
that's so exciting.
So yeah, it's really kind of snowballed there, and they're going to be funding an additional polytunnel and more beds for us in the next few weeks, actually, so we can ramp up our production. So yeah, there's lots of different fronts on which Worthy Earth is working at the moment.
That's amazing. Also, it's really interesting to think that half an acre can produce as much food as you've described for, let's say, just back to Blenheim, but half an acre, the fact that it can produce enough food for the restaurants that you mentioned, and then also veg boxes for the hundreds of staff that work at Blenheim.
Yeah.
It's kind of staggering because I imagine people think you must need so much more of an acreage to create a kind of return and a yield.
Absolutely. I mean, the no-dig approach is famous for its kind of yield, that it's possible to create abundance on a small area. I mean, we're by no means matching the full demand that Blenheim requires in terms of vegetables. We would have to cultivate the whole walled garden in order to do that. But currently managing half an acre on my own with a bit of help here and there. You know how I said it took 16 full-time gardeners to be able to manage the whole site. Well, I've kind of calculated that with our methods and sort of hardworking attitude towards it, we'd probably be able to do the whole thing with 4 or 5.
Wow.
So we are learning to be more efficient and more proactive with the way that we're growing. So yeah, we are making some progress. And I think that if Blenheim were to in the future invest in a larger scale operation, then we would actually be able to meet the full demands of that of the entire estate.
That's so cool. Because mentally, I imagine that people think you need so much more land to do that kind of thing. But I guess what's so interesting is, with the example that you've just given at that other estate down in Hampshire, I think you said, it's amazing how food, the no-dig approach, the kind of manual labour that's required for it is increasingly bringing people together in a way that I guess it would have done 100 years ago. Yeah. I mean, I sort of yearn for that communal feeling of being out in the fields together, growing food. I think it's a job that a lot of people would like to have. So at Worthy Earth, we're trying to actually make that a viable form of employment for people. It took us a long time to get to a stage where we were being able to be supported by the business itself. Really?
We were working second jobs and all sorts, but now we're at a stage where we can kind of, we're not making loads of money, but we're doing it in a way that enables us to work full time on it.
Yeah.
And we've also now this year employed 3 more relatively full-time people as well. So there are ways in which we can create a kind of market gardening sort of sector again. I mean, it's something which has fallen out of fashion. I think back in the 50s.
Is that when it fell out of? I didn't know.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think after the war, there's kind of been a slow decline in people that describe themselves as market gardeners. In the Victorian era, I think every single major town or city would have had a network of market gardens surrounding its edge that would supply the needs of that particular area. Even in London, there would have been huge areas of market gardeners that would supply the needs of London. The same still exists in Paris. Actually, they have a network of market gardens around the edge, which is what we've fallen behind. In fact, a lot of the veg that is sold at Covent Garden every morning probably comes from France. And so when you go and visit France, and all the towns have these kind of elaborate, markets that happen 3-4 times a week.
Abundant kind of, with an abundance of freshly grown veg.
That's because there are people actually doing the work involved in growing all of that. And it's not something that we do very much in this country, but it's something that we ought to do in order to actually sort of
sustain ourselves
and also improve our lives as well.
Yeah, it must be so hugely mentally rewarding also to just have your hands in the soil and kind of like actually, day to day and be feeding and sort of, nourishing other people by virtue of what you're creating. There's got to be a mental element to that, which in a very kind of chaotic, busy world that we all live in now, I can see why so many people would want to go and work for By the Earth or others.
Yeah, for sure.
And I didn't even know market gardens were a thing. Like I didn't know there was such a thing as a market gardener.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially defined as someone that is growing on a piece of land vegetables that are surpass the needs of that family and that therefore are growing food for the local community. It doesn't need to be defined in any other particular way. But yeah, the amount of local growers that you would see arriving at markets in town has really plummeted. A lot of the central areas in towns and cities that would ordinarily have been markets have now been, turned to high streets, which are now kind of becoming abandoned. I wonder if in the future, the abandonment of the high street could lead to another kind of resurgence of markets, which would be a nice sort of turn of events.
It really would, because it's so sad when you travel around the country and you see all these sort of, Grantham near Beaver is particularly like a good example of that. It used to have a thriving market feel to it, but it's sort of been lost over the last 20 years or so.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting thought. What are the key challenges, do you think, with more estates doing a version of what you're doing at Blenheim?
Well, as I described, the kind of funding issue of sort of not being able to afford to have a bunch of kitchen gardeners out there growing vegetables. But I think that Worthy Earth is trying to pioneer ways of making this more affordable and efficient by placing 1 or 2 people in a large walled garden and growing all the vegetables. We at Blenheim are cultivating about £30,000 worth of veg on literally half of an acre.
£30,000.
Well, that's what we're aiming towards, and that's calculated by just organic prices,
market value.
And we are achieving that, and so that cost can be offset against a lot of the catering budget and so on, which is what happens at Blenheim.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and then on top of that, there's also the kind of slightly more intangible values that having a kitchen garden in full use actually brings, the visitor element, the sustainability element. There are many reasons, I think, why it could be attractive to estates to choose to try and do this. But up till now, it's kind of, there hasn't really been anyone doing it.
Yeah, fascinating. I guess, the challenge in these times with these historic places is more often that, maybe young people don't naturally find themselves gravitating towards them. And that's the mission that I'm on with what we're doing at Heritage X. I'm interested because I think what you're doing speaks to so much of that younger generation who are interested in where their food comes from in a way that, I think the boomers perhaps missed out on a little bit, being the children of wartime generation. And so do you think that what you're doing and hopefully others are doing or will do one day, and you'll do at a greater and grander scale increasingly, do you think that will have an impact on the cultural significance of these historic places?
Absolutely. I mean, somewhere like Blenheim, for instance, obviously has a sort of mixed reputation. On the one hand, it's trying its best to be as sustainable as possible. Others might say it's a relic of sort of a past, an unequal past. But I think that actually being able to fund these types of projects is actually a really great step forward. It's putting investment into something that is important for the future. It's also inspiring people that come and visit. It's allowing me to bring volunteers that are mostly younger people into an environment that they wouldn't be able to be in ordinarily. And it's kind of recreating a culture around growing food again, which, as I said before, is kind of the root of all culture. And so if we can therefore stimulate that, then I think that it opens doors up to so many other types of cultural areas like cooking, foraging, sort of more sustainable farming practices at large. So it all kind of starts with growing vegetables again. So these wall gardens that lie empty in heritage sites across the UK because they don't have anyone to work them anymore, with a little bit of nudging, a bit of investment in, it can lead to a kind of large scale change, which although is still within the boundaries of heritage sites, but I think will have the kind of exposure that will inspire people to do it in more places as well.
Yeah, I agree. And that kind of takes us so neatly onto your second destination, because it's something that you've created, from my understanding, the Worthy Earth Festival. And I'd love to know more about, why you've chosen that as your second destination and what it's about. What is the festival about?
Sure. I mean, it's a harvest festival at the end of September, the autumn equinox, which is traditionally where we would celebrate the harvest. I know harvest festivals have a connotation with sort of Christian festivals. But this is kind of a reinvention of that, where we're bringing together all of the work that we've done over the year, and we're bringing it into one place, our HQ site in Hampshire. We're putting on a kind of excellent array of live music from folk and world musicians from around the globe, and we're situating it in the context of good food, as in growing food, eating food together. So we have these large-scale banquets where we get friends in that are professional caterers to basically use all the produce from the garden and turn it into these big sort of spreads for everyone to sit and enjoy.
Wow.
We also invite speakers from the regenerative agriculture movement to come and sort of share their wisdom and hopefully inspire people about sort of more conscious environmental ways of living, and just to have a good time, essentially.
That's so cool. And so when did you have the idea to create this festival?
In our sort of first or second year of doing it. I mean, as market gardeners in our first year, we didn't really make very much money at all. I think we split about £250 between the three of us.
In a year?
In the 6 months of growing, after, all of our costs had sort of... we broke even. We didn't lose money, but it's a tough gig. So we recognized in that first year that to make it work as a business, we had to diversify the different offerings that we were giving. So not only would we do veg boxes, but also we'd sell to chefs. We'd try and diversify the range of people that we're selling to, but also putting on these events that could bring people together, community events. And so, the festival kind of spawned as a kind of necessity to do something more with Worthy Earth. For me, Worthy Earth has always been more about just growing food, but using food growing as a catalyst for getting people together for the right reasons.
Because you feel that there's a void of community?
Yeah, particularly around Basingstoke, the area where we do the festival. There's kind of not really much for people to do and to enjoy. There's sort of work and shopping in the town centre and going to the pub or whatever, but when it comes to actually engaging in the sort of culture that I think we all desire and all want, which is a kind of more communal, back to the earth feeling, Well, the Earth Festival is just trying to embody that and bring people together for these types of reasons.
Wow. And so people can obviously book to join you at Where the Earth. It's not an invitation or anything.
No. It's a small festival. We only have 500 people, only 500 tickets available. There's still some available.
Amazing.
And it's on the autumn equinox, so 20th to the 22nd.
Okay.
But yeah, I chose as my destination that feasting table, particularly at Where the Earth Festival, because it is a special place. It's a moment where the whole season is tied together in this kind of, this feasting display, which I think is, such a powerful way of actually kind of finding ourselves together in solidarity and also empowering everyone in our community, because we've grown that food. We haven't brought anything in. It's all been made and grown there with love and with the support of volunteers that come as well. It's a really great way of tying people together.
Absolutely amazing. And the equinox, just for people that don't know, what is the equinox? What's the history of the kind of equinox? You briefly touched on it. But
it's just halfway between the two solstices.
Yeah.
So it's the moment at which we are, generally speaking, in the Northern Hemisphere, going to be harvesting the most food, because it's kind of the end of the summer season and the garden is full of abundance. And it just so happens that it's a kind of astrological time of significance as well.
I might even make it down there if I can. I would love
welcome.
to. And I guess it's a few days, is it? Or is it?
Yeah, it's a weekend, 3 days.
Okay, cool. So people, if they're thinking about it, then book off the weekend, basically. It's so interesting just to hear, because it sounds like to me like you're really thinking about everything in the round. And I think what I find particularly interesting about the work that you're doing more broadly is that, these historic houses, just peddling back to heritage, but these historic houses were always the lighthouses of communities. Like if you look back through history, they've always been the kind of heartbeat of local communities, is what my mum's always said. And I think it's been really interesting when we were doing the original podcast Dutchers. I thought that was just exclusive to Beaver, naively and kind of rather grandiosely thought that was just Beaver that was a heartbeat. And then when you travel around the country, I was really struck by how all of these estates and houses, be it a national trust property or a privately owned family run one still, they really are the kind of lifeblood of that local community.
Yeah.
And I think it's so exciting because what you're doing is, you're bringing another purpose. You're basically injecting the past back into that land, and in a new and imagined way. Yeah,
I mean, when I first joined Blenheim, they gave me a photo of the market gardening team from the 1910s or something. Everyone with their sort of flat caps and waistcoats and blazers and stuff that they used to garden in.
Is there a similar kit that you have to wear now?
I mean, I choose to, I guess, dress in a relatively like older-fashioned way, like rustic way or whatever. But those pictures really struck me because there was such a big team, such a that would work on these gardens and devote their lives to it. And they would be enriched by that experience of being able to work in such a prestigious and historic space. Their families and, of the workers would obviously have their connection with that place. And it's a shame that a lot of those jobs became sort of, obsolete, but I'm hoping that they can sort of be, made relevant again.
Yeah, I agree. What do you hope for, I guess, regenerative farming broadly and their significance to historic houses, perhaps more specifically, but also, Where the Earth, like it sounds like you're creating a bit of a movement to me.
Well, we're certainly part of a movement, and, there's conferences like the Oxford Real Farming Conference that happens at the beginning of January, which is a kind of big celebration of everyone working in regenerative agriculture, or groundswell that happened recently. It does feel like there's a lot of traction behind it at the moment. There's also a risk that traction could also lead to a kind of greenwashing or a sort of, quite a superficial engagement with what's happening. But from my perspective, from Where the Earth perspective, we want to create a network of market gardens around each area. We don't want to create any large scale things. We want to just, I think small is beautiful in a way. We don't want to extend our, beyond a couple of acres, let's say. We just want to provide jobs for as many people working in these market gardens to show that local food can be made available to local people, and it doesn't need to be more expensive than ordinary food. I would hope that in the future, the same funding that has been given from government to conventional farms could also be passed on to regenerative farmers, not just big scale, but small scale like us as well. Support that's necessary to get these things off the ground, some of the startup costs, because as I described a while ago, it's very difficult to actually make a living. We did receive some support from local councils in terms of grants and so on. There are charities out there, but I think there needs to be more support for small scale farmers. Because a recent study shows that basically for every pound that is spent in the local food economy, it creates, I think, 4 times the amount of money within the local community than the same pound spent in supermarket chains, for instance. A lot of that money is just, sort of going nowhere. Bringing food from overseas is not contributing to our public health, to the health of our communities. I think,
and also to that, to that kind of heartbeat feeling that we missed. Like, I want to be able to go into a market town like we can in France and decipher between the tomatoes, and that doesn't exist anymore here. So it'd be such an amazing feeling to reinvigorate that. But it'll be interesting to see what happens, in the next 5 years with the new government, and whether they put energy into this, because it feels like that's what it needs, just an injection of sort of top down.
Yeah, I think so. But also a huge thrust from the bottom as well. I'm standing on the shoulders of many generations before me that have fought for this sort of life. It's a sort of rural argument, I guess, that we should be able to grow our own food in a self-sufficient sort of way within our communities. You only need to go abroad to so many other countries to see that fully in motion. We just have outsourced a lot of our food production in this country and left communities bereft of the opportunity to eat fresh food. And that can be solved relatively quickly if we just give the people the support they need to make it happen.
And I guess, and land. And I think that's the interesting thing, because estates are not devoid of, some of these estates, be it, again, public ones or independent ones, they're not devoid of land. They're just devoid of, in many instances, the kind of capital to invigorate it in lots of cases. But, I think there's such a number of amazing estates out there that I'm sure would be all too willing to kind of see their kitchen garden being reinstated in a way that's conducive to creating that community and reinstating themselves as a heartbeat to that local community.
Absolutely.
So it's quite exciting. I'm very excited to hear what you're doing, because I think it's something that I'm sure will catch on increasingly.
I hope so.
If you can make one major policy change that's related to sustainability and regenerative farming practices, do you have an inkling as to what that might be and why? Yeah,
I mean, I guess some financial support for these, the startup costs for small farmers to go about creating a market garden. We touched on land. In some ways, buying your own piece of land is not strictly necessary. I think for starting this, along our journey, we've been able to, well, people have approached us, that have, land and have asked us if we can start a market garden on their field, or in their estates, let's say. So I don't think it's a question of being able to, necessarily buy it. It's a question of finding a kind of local fund that can go towards the startup costs of creating this.
Yeah.
And so that would be the policy change that I would bring in, and probably take some subsidies away from the slightly more harmful forms of farming that have been so well subsidized over the last 50 years or so.
Yeah, but it sounds like that's all changed, that because there's also, I guess, there's regenerative farming, which is what we're discussing, and then there's rewilding. And it's interesting, there's an estate, there's an amazing house that's on the Heritage Act called Doddington, and they've just done a big rewilding program there. Obviously, Knepp is the kind of famous estate for rewilding. Isabella Tree, the kind of custodian there, who's reinvigorated the estate that was a monoculture and is now sort of thriving. And I love how Ben Goldsmith always describes visiting Knepp as like there's a throng of kind of sound and songbird and bees and bugs and stuff, which I'm yet to experience firsthand. But what is rewilding for those that don't know? I
mean, I'm not an expert in rewilding, but from my knowledge, it's basically rather than cultivating it intensively over generations and not allowing any nature to thrive there, you're basically giving it back to nature, and that will be a process that takes many, many years. And it's kind of steering it in a sensitive way to create a habitat for wildlife and to create the biodiversity that we miss. Even on my drive to Beaver, actually, I was, it's a kind of very classic drive through the English countryside where you have just basically flat fields, not very many trees. A lot of the trees have been deforested to make way for these large sort of fields. It was only actually when I came to Beaver that the trees started to emerge again. But it was as if it was a kind of beacon on the landscape where trees were, because of the heritage that the place allowed, to continue to exist. And so, rewilding, I guess, is trying to bring back a sort of wild Britain, a sort of forested areas that, you don't just get a forest immediately. There is a whole succession of plants and animals that have to lead up to that point that takes a long time to sort of come into being. But I think we're just trying to create a forested area again that would breathe oxygen back into the UK.
Yeah, literally. So Harrison, what would you say to anyone that's listening and has been really enthralled by everything that you've shared with us already, and is perhaps also thinking they want to do something similar or be a support of, the work that you're doing, or market gardeners and gardening as a whole? What would you suggest or say to them?
I would say seek out your local land-based enterprise that's doing something similar to what Worthy Earth is doing. So be it a market garden or a rewilding project, reach out to them and try and do some volunteering. I understand that means giving up some of your time as free labor, but ultimately that's the way that you're going to, sort of get exposure to the skills and experience to be able to do it yourself. Every week I'm lucky enough to have some volunteers that come and join. They have a great time. In fact, one of them said to me recently that it was the most human that they've ever felt working on the market garden.
Wow.
Which is quite an amazing thing to hear. So, it's time that you can spend dedicating yourself to a good cause, feeling great in yourself, doing that job out in nature, working in an honest sort of way. But you're also learning the skills that you can then use to take that into your own journey. Shadowing people that are doing this professionally as a means of learning how to do it yourself.
Yeah. I mean, I just more broadly as well, I just think you seem so grounded as a human being. What impact do you think the career that you've created for yourself has done to you? Were you always, has it changed you at all?
I feel relaxed.
Yeah, really.
I feel like market gardening is, there is stresses involved. You have to be nimble in your mind and in your body. It's a lot of hard work to work the kitchen garden like I do at Blenheim. It's
physically.
It's physically a tiring job. I'm doing the work of probably 3 or 4 people from back in the day. Yeah. I think that gives you a longevity in life. to be able to work hard physically and also keep your mind active. I don't really spend any time sitting at a desk or on my laptop or whatever. I'm just outside all of the time. And I think, that obviously has known physical and mental health benefits that I would wish other people to share as well.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. So I guess what would be your message to future generations before we come on to your final destination, which I'm so excited to chat about, but what would be your kind of message to future generations that are interested in preserving heritage, but also, I guess, more broadly, like our nature and our land, which is our heritage? I think people around the world, when they think of England, they think of our countryside. We're so uniquely kind of intrinsically attached to our countryside. But what would you say to future generations about what you're doing and what you're passionate about with Wear the Earth?
Well, I would say firstly that a thriving countryside is one that involves a lot of rural workers. It's not just a patchwork of empty fields where one person goes around in a tractor covering 1,000 acres. But we need to be able to find ways of actually repopulating these rural spaces with honest workers. But the main piece of advice I think I would say is not to wait for anyone to do it for you. There's obviously great forms of protest and government appeal and all that, but it doesn't necessarily lead to tangible changes. I've been able to capture that feeling of dissatisfaction that I've had with the way that things are run and the way that things look in the countryside, and actually just try and do something myself. That's obviously a big plunge that, I've done something that I didn't have any training in, that I didn't learn how to necessarily do properly. And I've made a bunch of mistakes in the early process of doing it, but actually just starting and directing that kind of anger that you might feel as a young person into something that is direct and constructive. I would say that that's my piece of advice for future generations.
Amazing. Okay, and then your final destination and recommendation today, which I'm so excited to hear about because I was lucky enough to visit Lowther Castle, which I know is your final destination. But tell us a bit about why you've chosen Lowther.
Jim and Vanessa Lowther are the kind of owners of Lowther Castle. Well, I was lucky enough to be invited by Jim and Vanessa Lowther up to Lowther Castle in Cumbria, and they caught wind of what I was doing down at Blenheim and sort of invited me up there to have a little look at their walled garden, which is, same old story, kind of totally derelict and sort of hasn't been used. It was used a lot in the Victorian times and up until the 1920s, but soon sort of fell out of production. Jim Lowther in particular has done an amazing job in, sort of starting a huge rewilding project across the Lowther estate. He's incredibly into it. And regenerating the walled garden would be a kind of next stage in that whole project. And also, I just really enjoyed visiting Lowther Castle. The grounds are incredible. The head gardener there, she does an incredible job. It's a very, very thoughtfully designed visitor experience, I think. I just really enjoyed the views and the incredible fresh air that Lowther Castle gives. So if you're ever in the Lake District, I would thoroughly recommend visiting Lowther Castle.
I completely agree. And also, just for our listeners as well, it's kind of amazing because I think it wasn't Jim's father, but it was his predecessor that took the roof off Lowther Castle. So it is actually a ruin, but it's the most well-kept, well-preserved, family-run ruin you'll ever see, I think, in the UK, or one of. And as you've said, it's amazing because what they've done very cleverly is they planted in the ruins. So it's got this incredible kind of garden experience as you walk through the ruins, which I found very romantic because there's a hollowness to seeing a ruin that I can feel when I go around them. But actually what they've done so cleverly, the Lowther family, is they've planted this kind of incredible garden in the ruins and within it. And it just feels... It's incredibly romantic, actually. I don't know. I found it really moving, actually, going around it.
I was moved by it too. And there's a kind of metaphor in there as well that even within the ruin of something, there can be new growth, like coming from within it.
So true.
And I think that's kind of the ethic of regeneration or regenerative farming, which they've managed to basically model within the ruin there. So it's quite an inspiring place.
Yeah, it really is. Oh, well, Harrison, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. And I really am so inspired by your work. And I think so many other people will be, because it's so important. And I think the fact that you're the age that you are and you're doing it like at this time in this moment in the way that you are, and you're doing it at such a significant place like Blenheim, and many other incredible estates that you've taken us through today. I'm really excited to watch Wear the Earth and where it goes and grows, more importantly.
Thank you.
But thank you so much. And where can people find you if they want to follow along?
Well, our website, weartheearth.co.uk, or Instagram we use. Not particularly great at it. I'm not a social media influencer. I post occasional pictures of vegetables.
No, I think I love the Instagram. I feel like serene just when I come across like lots of selfies on an Instagram feed, and then actually Worthy Earth's Instagram is kind of like beautiful to just come across in the feed.
I do try and take more videos and pictures and stuff, but by the time I've got my phone out and try to take a picture, I've lost about 40 minutes of my working day. So I need somebody else to do it for me.
Yeah. Well, I've so enjoyed meeting and chatting with you properly, and I really hope that lots of other places, you know, be it estates or farms, or really look to you and what you're doing to get inspired and hopefully do more together.
Thank you.
You can learn more about Worthy Earth and the important work that they do by visiting their website, worthy-earth.co.uk. If you feel inspired by our conversation with Harrison today and you want to go and visit a historic house for yourself, go to Heritage X, our new historic houses platform for independent heritage sites across the UK. Just visit www.heritageexplore.com.